Estamos aqui na frente do Capitólio, já estão se reunindo as pessoas para a comitiva de imprensa. Já temos vários parlamentares juntos aqui.
Liberdade. Um forte abraço ao povo de Goiânia, um forte abraço ao povo de
deputados, senadores, jornalistas internacionais, advogados, juízes, todos num só objetivo de defender a liberdade do nosso país.
Olha, é importante porque a gente percebe claramente que muita gente...
First, I'd like to thank you, Congressman, for giving us time and a platform to come here today and talk about what's happening in Brazil. This is something that we no longer have in our nation. We no longer have the privilege of saying the truth, saying what we think, and giving our opinion. So to start, I'd like to ask you a simple question. Is Venezuela a democracy or a dictatorship? I believe all of you here today agree with me that Venezuela is not a democracy. It's far from it. It's a dictatorship. But then I have another question. Does Venezuela have a Supreme Court? Does Venezuela have a Ministry of Education? Does Venezuela have Congress? Does Venezuela have public ministry? No. Yes, they have. But they are no longer a democracy. Because all these institutions that are valuable for a democracy have been kidnapped and are served as an instrument of oppression. They are served only as to arrest and oppress people for their opinions. And what we have today in Brazil is exactly the same thing. Our Supreme Court in Brazil does not protect the Constitution anymore. As a matter of fact, they are releasing drug dealers, they are releasing criminal leaders of trafficking, and they're putting in prison congressmen, simple people, for their opinions. The reason why the leader of opposition is not here today, Carlos Jordi, the leader of the opposition in our Congress is not here today because he had his passport seized. He can no longer leave his country to tell the world what's happening in Brazil. Many other congressmen are not here today because they have had their passports seized. There's something called a fishing expedition. Pretty much everyone beside me here today has suffered. We've had our houses invaded by the federal police on a decision of Alexandre de Moraes, trying to fight something against us because we tell the truth, because of our opinions. In Brazil, the most dangerous thing you can do today is tell your opinion, speak your mind. But if you do drug dealing, if you murder people, if you do any other crime, you will be defended actually. So we are here today using this platform that you so gratefully gave us to tell the world that Brazil is no longer a democracy. What is happening in our country can happen in your country as well. Pay attention to our country. There was a poll conducted recently in Brazil to 3,000 people, I believe, asking them if they believe they live in a democracy or if they live in a dictatorship of the judiciary. Believe it or not, half the people answered that we live today under dictatorship of judiciary. Half the population of our country understands that Brazil is no longer a democracy. More than half of the congressmen also believe that, also understand that, but they are afraid to act. And the reason they are afraid to act is because the moment we try to pass a bill, giving back to Congress the leadership or the right to pass bill or to legislate, we immediately suffer intimidation. Phone calls from ministers of the justice harassing and threatening congressmen if they don't do exactly what the Supreme Court says. So I'm here today representing the leader of the opposition, Carlos Jordi, who was not able to be here today, representing Daniel Silveira, a congressman who was also arrested, and many others. Carla Zambelli, who cannot be here today because her passport was seized. This can no longer continue the way it is. And to finish, I would like you to take a look at the faces of all my friends who are here beside me today. These brave men and women. These people now are at risk of the moment we set foot back in Brazil. We can be arrested, we can suffer search and seizure, we can have our lives destroyed. Why? Because of corruption? Because we steal public money? No, because we're fighting for real democracy, because we don't want to see Brazil becoming a Venezuela if that's not too late. So I would like to thank every congressman and congresswoman who are standing here beside me today for having the courage to come here and commit a crime in Brazil, which is tell the truth. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Give us this opportunity. We are very honored, and we want to bring here some light for what is going on in Brazil. My name is Eduardo Bolsonaro. I'm the most voted ever congressman in the history of Brazil, also son of President Bolsonaro and former chairman of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Committee. I have always warned in my speeches in the Congress about the dangers of my country turning into a Cuba or Venezuela with their concentration camps. Today, unfortunately, I live in my own movie about the Gulag. And for those who think I'm exaggerating, I will cite here few simple names. Felipe Martins, the international advisor to President Bolsonaro, as Jared Kushner was to President Trump. A brilliant young man in his 30s with a promising future, imprisoned by an exception tribunal, accused of a coup d'etat never attempted or planned, and without the hope of minimally fair treatment, as due process and broad defense no longer exists in Brazil. Colonel Câmara, the Bolsonaro security detail, who is now also in jail accused of an imaginary coup d'etat. And like them, veterinarians, gospel singers, sign language interpreters, comedians as Bismarck Fugas, and even a homeless and a person diagnosed with a high degree of autism, all of them imprisoned, accused of a coup d'etat. It's very clear that all this oppression and cruelty is just a step towards the ultimate goal, to imprison my father, the president who dared to put the interests of Brazilians first. My father is now prosecuted and slandered in the most various ways. As in every tyranny, the limit of the ridiculous no longer exists. And he even faces the accusation of having committed the terrible crime of disturbing a whale. That's not a joke. He is criminally charged for passing by a whale on a jet ski. And the most impressionable thing is the complaint was made by Lula da Silva's environmental minister. This is more ridiculous than what Trump is having as charged here in the United States. My father is also accused of attempting a coup d'etat when he was no longer president. The judiciary, appointed by the Communist Party in power, want us to believe that my father waited to leave power and, when he no longer had the armed forces under his command, attempted a coup d'etat with elderly and unarmed women, all of these thousands of kilometers away from Brazil, when my father was in vacations in the United States. Going to the end, they want us to believe, Mr. Chris Smith, that women, elderly ladies, and all kinds of ordinary citizens, unarmed, are a danger to the rule of law. And those violating the rights and fundamental guarantees are the saviors. Ladies and gentlemen, these stories are not something that someone told me. We are living this right now, and with not even a single word from Biden administration, State Department, or any governmental authority from the homeland of democracy, the United States of America. The dozen colleagues that are following me here also will talk about terrifying situations. Brazil, unfortunately, is not a democracy anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Eduardo.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you in the name of the Brazilian people for this opportunity we have here to speak up, to say what is going on in Brazil more freely than we can do in our own country, unfortunately. Thank you, America, for the long-standing relationship with Brazil. The United States of America is the largest democracy in the Americas. Brazil is the second largest, or used to be. We all know that democracy is an ongoing process, while freedom, as Ronald Reagan once said, is not passed on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected and handed on for them to do the same. This is why we are here, to fight for our freedoms and to call to the world's attention the severe setbacks we are experiencing today in Brazil's democracy, freedom and rule of law. When I first arrived in Washington DC 15 years ago to study at Georgetown University, and I'm very proud of that, I looked at Latin America and saw how socialism was subverting countries that were once democracies. Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. While those countries were succumbing to tyrants like Hugo Chavez and other puppets of Fidel Castro, and while their people were losing their freedoms, Brazil remained democratic despite the country's historical institutional flaws and endemic corruption. That was the year 2009. Throughout the decade of 2010, Brazil entered a new era in which I was very optimistic. We all were. It was a period of time when millions of concerned citizens took to the streets to protest widespread corruption pervading our country's leadership. Operation Car Wash brought these issues to justice and put dozens of businessmen, public servants and politicians behind bars for money laundering and corruption, including the then former president Lula da Silva. He was found guilty as charged in 3 instances and sent to jail to serve a 9-year sentence. Not only in Brazil, by the way, but also Peru, Guatemala and Panama had presidents convicted by corruption in their countries because of the investigations that started in Brazil involving transnational companies that also operated abroad. However, in the beginning of 2019, Operation Car Wash began investigating another branch of power in Brazil, the judiciary. Whistleblowers exposed bribing schemes in the justice system all the way to the Supreme Court. When the story was published in the media, all hell broke loose. The Supreme Court's president at the time, Dias Toffoli, an alleged participant in the bribing scheme, decided to censor Cruzoé magazine and opened an investigation accusing them of spreading fake news. Justice Toffoli appointed Justice Alexandre de Moraes to become the rapporteur judge of the case. The investigation, actually an inquisition, has the Supreme Court as an alleged victim, investigator, and judge at the same time. It is still open 5 years later and has been weaponized to persecute anyone whom the court itself understands to be criticizing it or opposing the views of its members. The number of people criminally prosecuted, or should I say more accurately, persecuted, by Justice Moraes and the court amount to thousands of Brazilians right now. Some of those here, some of those can't return to the country. From ordinary citizens to members of parliament, including the leader of the opposition, as just mentioned by my colleague Gustavo Gayer, journalists, opinion makers, and even judges. We have a judge right here that also asked for political asylum in the United States and is living here right now. From a homeless individual who was just absolved by Mr. Moraes after serving a lengthy prison sentence for being at the January 8th event by chance, to the former president of the Republic, Bolsonaro. Nobody escapes the rage and unconstitutional acts and decisions of the court. Assets frozen illegally, bank accounts secretly breached with no due process, passports taken, censorship, even torture. This is the case of Mr. Clériston Pereira da Cunha, known in Brazil as Clezão, who died in prison after spending 11 months in poor health conditions behind bars, including 2.5 months after an order for his release that was signed by the general prosecutor, but it was ignored by Mr. Alexandre de Moraes. On the other hand, the convictions of corrupt politicians are being annulled by the Supreme Court, as was the case of Lula, who was released from jail and allowed to campaign for the presidency again by a Supreme Court decision contrary to the ruling of the lower courts. Businesses that were fined for their bribing schemes are being absolved too, and the fines are being cancelled by the same court. What we are experiencing in Brazil right now is a developing dictatorship. It is therefore not surprising that Lula da Silva's biggest allies are dictators, such as Venezuela's Maduro, China's Xi Jinping, and Russia's Vladimir Putin.
And Hamas.
Even the terrorist group Hamas sent congratulations to Lula as he returned to power, and is now congratulating Lula on his absurd remarks towards Jews and the state of Israel, comparing the legitimate defense acts of Israel to the Holocaust in Hitler's Germany. Different than other dictatorships, however, the one we are seeing in Brazil is built in a more subtle and dangerous way. The judicial system itself is leading the institutional rupture, which makes it more difficult for the world to understand this sad and dangerous process. People tend to trust judges more than they tend to trust politicians. In Brazil, however, trust in the Supreme Court has fallen dramatically. A recent poll by Atlas Intel shows that more than 50% of the population has lost completely the trust in the courts, corroborating the feeling that the decisions of the Supreme Court are rather political than legal, constitutional, or just. I repeat, Mr. Congressman, our goal here is to make the situation well known to the world. We love our country. We love Brazil. We love the United States of America. We love freedom and we love democracy. And we understand that these virtues are only possible where there is strong rule of law. 15 years after living in the city of Washington, D.C. as a student, I look back to my own country, now as a member of Congress, with maybe a more realistic view, if not sad. This very opportunity that you give us, however, to share this message with you, with the American people, and with all the world, renews our optimism and hope. As much as we love America, none of us want to live in another country. We want to live in another Brazil. God bless America. God bless Brazil. God bless you all. Thank you so much.